been asked to introduce our two distinguished panelists who truly are today. Before we do, however, I've been asked to remind you that no recording is permitted of this. We don't want people to get in trouble over copyrights. Lawsuits are ugly. You might get named as co-defendant. So put all the recording devices away and just enjoy the conversation. I first met Jim Blinn more years ago. Well, neither of us had any gray hair at that point. I'll let it go at that. When computer graphics was first beginning to come to the fore, people suddenly saw that this was something that wasn't just in a laboratory. It was something that could be exciting, that could be visuals that no one had ever seen. Beginning in my case with his simulated flybys of Jupiter and Saturn for NASA at JPL. And the stuff was so intriguing, I went to my editor at the LA Times and said, we gotta cover this. This is something really new and exciting. And met Jip then and have been writing about his work ever since, which has always been at the cutting edge of computer graphics. In fact, computer graphics as we know it would not exist without him. And he's picked up a few awards along the way, everything from a PhD to a MacArthur grant. So definitely someone we're very lucky to have here today. He doesn't do a lot of public appearances these days. And chatting with him will be Tad Gilo, another old friend who goes back to some of the first uses of CG at Disney. The gears inside Big Ben in Great Mouse Detective, the fleet of computer animated taxi cabs and the pipes and so forth that the Cats and Dogs and Oliver and Company cavorted around. And a very charming early short from Disney that involved 2D drawn animation and CG that was off his rockers. And that is Mr. Tad Gilo. So, gentlemen, take it away.
Thank you, Charles. I don't need that. Well, thank you. We're already starting off. I didn't know Charles was going to do such a wonderful introduction, so I don't have to do a big introduction for Jim. With the exception of, one of the things in my research and talking to him, finding quotes, and one was an interesting from another industry pioneer, Ivan Sutherland, who once said, there are a dozen good computer scientists, or about a dozen good computer scientists, and Jim Blinn is 6 of them. And that's just how he's gone about his life and been able. He's dives in and just gets it done. And so we're going to explore a little bit about how he came up from college, from earlier days, and up through JPL, and explore some of his life story. Whoops, now we have to go back already. Where do we go? Okay. So I wanted to kind of start out with him and talk about some of the really early days, even before college and grade school, and some of the things. We've all been inspired by things, and I know you've had a lot of always had interest in astronomy and in animation. But some of that came from early experiments and early watching, films that we might have seen when we were in grade school.
I was a child of the 50s, like the first generation who grew up with television. So I did the Saturday morning cartoon thing, very early on, and was always a big fan of animation. And also, I was a big fan of astronomy. I wanted to be an astronomer. It was my first career goal. And but I got a chance to see some things that actually mix those two together. There are 2 major series of films that were shown when I was a kid. It was a response to Sputnik, in fact, to try to increase the education of science in the country. One of them was Man in Space by the Disney studio, and there were 2 sequels, The Man in the Moon and Mars and Beyond. And the other one was some series that were funded by the Bell Telephone Network, the Bell Science series, that were also contained animation about various visualizations of scientific phenomena. And these 2 inspired me, but not in a way that I said, gee, I want to do that when I grow up. I just thought, these are really cool, I want to see more of these. And so later on, I was able to produce them myself, even though, as we'll get to, it was almost accidental that happened. But we have a little clip of one of the Bell Science things, just to kind of give you a flavor of what sort of things were shown to kids in the mid-50s for science education.
So one of the wonders of the internet, being able to find this stuff, download it, and cut a little snippet of. It's an hour-long program that we're going to cut down into 2 minutes.
The Bell telephone system brings you one of a series of programs on the sun to understand nature laws.
What you fill balloons with. For hydrogens, if they are 30 million degrees hot, 30 million degrees, it is not children playing with matches. The 4 hydrogens come out 1 helium. The carbon comes back the same, you see? Same weight, no change. That's why we call this the carbon cycle. Now we weigh the helium. Should weigh 400 ounces like the hydrogen. Oh yes, naturally. But it can be. The helium weighs 3 ounces less than the hydrogen. Where did the 3 ounces go? That is the magic of the stars. That is the secret of the hydrogen bomb. I show you. Come back, 3 ounces. Here is where they went. They changed into...
Animation a little bit different back in the 50s. So after seeing that, and you also did some experimentation on your own.
Yeah, well, a friend of mine and I tried to make animation ourselves when I was in high school. We first tried to do cell animation. We got screen door plastic, and we couldn't make the paint stick to it, so we wound up making paper cutouts instead. And aimed my parents' 8mm movie camera at the thing and did some simple tests, but we didn't know what we were doing and made a lot of technical mistakes, and so the results were not very satisfactory. And again, I kind of thought of this as a hobby rather than anything that was going to become a career, because I was not that much of an artist. I was, more interested in math and science, even though my parents were both artists. So I guess I inherited some of it from them. But then I went to the University of Michigan as an undergraduate to study physics originally, and wound up getting entrapped, shall we say, by computers. One of the things that I find remarkable about my career is that there are kind of 3 major transitions that happen, and they happened at exactly the right time. My timing was impeccable in all of them, because I arrived at Michigan and wound up getting a job programming for one of the graduate students who was doing a project doing circuit diagrams, basically, and so I helped him out on a computer called a PDP-9. It was like the size of a bunk bed, and it had 16K of memory, and it could do simple black and white line drawings.
That was K.
Yeah, 16K
Kilobytes.
of memory. Oh, yeah, right. And when he finished his PhD and graduated, the computer was still there. And so basically, I had a personal computer that nobody else hardly ever knew about to play around with for the next 4 years, which I was able to do lots of interesting experiments and kind of, enhance my skills on. For example, the next picture, some experiments with 3D line drawing animation, a little bit of hidden line elimination, and things could move around more or less in real time here. So I didn't take a lot of movies of this because I could go and see it live all the time. So it's not as documented as it might be. It's one lesson I should give you, is make sure you document your work so you can show it 30 years later to people. The next picture shows one of my first attempts at character animation, which worked better than I thought it would. Basically, you could tell it arm and leg joint angles and record the frame and change the angles typing in with a keyboard. There's no graphical input here, and then play it back, and I could make the guy walk around on the screen. The next thing shows.
I think we're gonna. All right, we're gonna try some
switch
fun
over.
here.
Yeah, this is a silent film, so the thing should be down, and that would be that one there. Yeah. This is kind of a bad video transfer of some early science animation that I did. this shows a spin vector of an electron in a rotating magnetic field, and it's. Oh, we're not seeing.
Oh.
Oh, we need to show the laptop again on the screen.
Is the laptop nook?
It's been changed into.
What's that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you'll just have to come up here and so. Oh, okay.
Ah,
Oh,
there we go. Ah, that's. We will.
You know, there's 60 years of technology experience here. We can't figure this stuff out either.
It's all Macintoshes. I don't understand Macintoshes.
It is the Mac.
Okay. Anyway, so this shows the sort of thing that was in real time. We actually recorded this on 8mm film. Sit there, we press a key on the keyboard to make the next frame,
Yeah.
press the shutter on the camera, and we go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth in order to film it.
Okay.
So anyway, you get kind of a flavor of it. This is done as part of a series showing what nuclear magnetic resonance, how that works internally with the spins.
So this was done when?
This was done about 1972.
So
Yeah, dates are, I'm going to try to give dates on these things just to give a sense of, where we're going on it. So now we have to put the
try back to Keynote here.
keynote, and then we have to drag keynote over to the left.
Yeah.
There we go.
What's
Yeah.
that?
Oh,
I'm just
keynote
gonna hit
stays
play.
put because it knows how to,
Oh, all right.
yeah.
Put it back.
I brought all these Windows video files here and making them work on a non-Windows machine is a video encoding is still kind of a black art, it seems. It's really strange.
Okay.
Okay.
Good.
So then I
So
went
that-
off to Utah.
Yeah. So after spending your undergraduate at
Undergraduate, and I got a master's degree, and then I stuck around for another 2 years just hanging out. Because I had this cool toy, why move away from that?
And what brought you to Utah?
Well, Utah was kind of like the mecca of computer graphics at the time. One of my office mates gave me a copy of a thesis that was published at Utah, which was pictures of shaded images thing, which is the coolest thing on earth, I thought. And so ultimately I wound up applying there for graduate school to get a PhD. And again, I got to Utah at exactly the right time. My thesis advisor was Martin Newell, who digitized the teapot originally as part of his PhD thesis, and then it became a kind of like a standard test object in computer graphics afterwards. And so when I first got there, Utah was just getting the good equipment. They were getting the first frame buffer. It's a 512 by 512 bytes memory, like more memory, computer memory in one place than had ever been seen on the Earth, something like that. And so I got there and I started implementing a Catmull's algorithm for rendering curved surfaces, which in the next frame, and using the teapot as a test object. And over there on the left is an experiment in rendering, showing highlights and so forth. And so I got interested in figuring out how shading works. The best shading algorithm at that time was by a guy named Phong, who had graduated just previously. But it was sort of constructed artificially to roughly approximate how light really reflects off the surfaces. So I spent a lot of time in the library poking around through various journals trying to figure out what the physicists knew about light reflection. This was before the World Wide Web, and so you couldn't just type in light reflection and see what happens. But it was, basically the engineering library had racks and racks of journals from things, and one thing I stumbled across was the Journal of the Illumination Engineering Society from 1920, and this was people who designed light fixtures, and they had actually measurements of how much light gets reflected from a surface in different directions, given how direction it comes in on. And so I was trying to digitize these drawings without a digitizing device, but then I stumbled across a more recent paper by a guy named Ken Torrance and his thesis advisor Sparrow in Minnesota that gave a mathematical model for it. But it was all in spherical trigonometry and very kind of complicated. So I spent like weeks and weeks doing trigonometric identities, trying to figure out a better way of calculating it. Eventually turned it into vector algebra, which made it very simple. So I published this in SIGGRAPH is what I call the Torrance Sparrow model, but the adaptation to computer graphics was mine. And later on, various commercial software programs included that as one of their standard lighting models. And so there's a menu item called Blinn shading in many of these things. And that's probably the only reason anybody in the younger generation has heard my name. But in fact, I always thought of it as the Torrance Sparrow model, and I figured they call it Blinn shading because that's smaller and fits onto a menu button better than Torrance Sparrow. Anyway, then Martin also had an idea for doing light reflection of, instead of kind of following the ray backwards from the eye and bouncing it out to see what would have been reflected in a particular direction of the surface. So I went and implemented that and did environment mapping, which was, you give it a model of how much light is coming from different directions, and then it'll figure out what the reflection should be in the teapot. So the teapot was a good test object to do these because it's, curved and the surface is going in different directions. So that was the early texturing work. The next thing
you mentioned, because there's the Illumination Engineering Society. While I was researching this and working with Jim, they are still around, but they are right now. A lot of their research is in light bulbs. So they've been around for a long, long time.
Next, we have video again on the.
We're going to try this again.
Yeah, now we've practiced it. The summer of 1976, when I was at Utah, I went to work for Ed Catmull at New York Institute of Technology as what amounts to an intern, because he had started an animation group there. And so when I was there, this is a test thing that I did just to test the thing. This is probably the first animation ever to use texture mapping. Very impressive, right? And this is also kind of a fun project. I got a bunch of pictures from Edward Marbridge's album of bodies in motion and measured the arm and leg joints kind of with a protractor and put them in an equation, did what's called Fourier interpolation to get the angles in between, and then had the thing rotate around. And so the motion of it looks quite nice, although the images that you've just seen are all like 256 by 256 pixels, because that's all we could afford to do animation in those days. So that's that. This is, like I say, 1976 was back. The individual frames took in the neighborhood of 5 minutes to make, and so we rendered them and saved them onto a tape, I guess, and then we played back the tape. That's probably similar to how things go nowadays. Although we don't use tape, we use discs. Yeah. All of the frames that I do in most of my animation take between 5 and 10 minutes, and that became kind of like a rule that I came up with. It always takes 5 minutes to make a frame, and if the computer gets faster, you just make more complicated frames.
Known as Blinn's law.
Yeah, right. Well, there's also a law that says, anybody who comes up with some slightly nihilistic view of the world and they put their name on it, that becomes their law. So when I got back to Utah, I wanted to do some more experiments with science animation, and I wanted to make a picture of a water molecule. It's 2 oxygens and a hydrogen. And, conventionally, you think of the electrons as whizzing around the nucleus, which is a bit of a metaphor for what's going on in terms of the quantum mechanics and so forth. But I wanted to make this look like something streaming around the nucleus. I was kind of going for an effect like a ball of yarn, sort of wrap, the trajectories all kind of wrapping on top of each other. So I attempted to do this with conventional texture mapping of light and dark, and it just didn't look right. It looked like Formica, sort of a smooth surface with a pattern painted on it. So it didn't give the view I want. And so I was thinking, how can I make this look more bumpy? And I was looking down at my shoes, which had kind of a leather texture on them, and I was thinking, the reason that this looks bumpy is not because the surface is displaced by a large amount, it's because the angle to the light kind of varies from one place to the next. So how can I do that mathematically? And I worked out some math to do that. And I went to go and make some test images with it, and our frame buffer broke. The frame buffer at Utah was the first one that E&S, Evans and Sutherland Computer Company made. New York Tech bought a few of them as well later. And when it was when I first arrived there, it was still being constructed, and the engineer who was building it was Jim Kajia. And once he got the thing finished, he moved back to graduate school and became a professor himself. But the time that he got the thing, I was kind of saying, when's it going to work? How do I work this? And so I finally got it working, went home, and so I immediately went in and started writing little programs like type in X and Y and a number and it puts a pixel on it. Wow, there's a pixel on the screen. How cool is that? So type in, there's another pixel. Now I can make a whole line of pixels. It's, boy, typing numbers is boring. We've got this digitizing tablet. Let me just kind of read the position on the digitizing tablet and put the pixel there. And so I wrote another little loop, read digitizing tablet, put pixel on the screen. It's, wow, I'm painting on the screen. It's like, oh, that's right. I realized I was just reproducing the work this guy named Dick Schaup in Xerox PARC had done. So he made kind of like the first paint program a couple of years before, but I made maybe the second one. Anyway, so coming back to water and the bump thing, I wound up actually flying back out to New York Tech the Christmas of 1976 to try out the idea and see if it's going to work. And it seemed to sort of work, but the math was not quite right. So I came back to Utah. Finally, they got the frame buffer fixed. And then I was able to do this. Leather donuts and strawberries. And basically, these patterns were, the pattern was drawn using the paint program kind of manually, and then the pattern determines, like the altitude, and you take various derivatives and so forth, and you get the tilt vector for the thing. So that became a useful tool for approximating more detail on the surface than you would get geometrically, just do it part with the lighting.
So after Utah, JPL beckons.
Yeah.
How did that come about for you?
Well, as I say, I've always been interested in astronomy, and I'd kind of learned about JPL when I was at Michigan, but I realized, JPL is in the astronomy area, and I'm in computer science, and so I didn't seriously think I'd be working there. But when I finished PhD at Utah, I called up Ivan Sutherland, who I had met before. He was the department chairman at Utah, and he left just before I got there. But he went to Caltech. So I called him up at Caltech, said, hi, I just graduated, remember me, and I'd like to see if there's a place for me in your department. But to be honest with you, since Caltech, JPL is part of Caltech, I said I'd probably go and hang out at JPL to see if there's something I can attach myself to. And he says, well, funny thing about that, turns out there's this guy at JPL named Bob Holtzman who had just had some money left over at the end of the fiscal year, and he got a whole bunch of graphics equipment that he wasn't sure what to do with, but it looked like it might be useful for something. And so he got exactly the same stuff we had at Utah. So that's cool. All the software that I had, came right over. So they hired me on as a postdoctoral fellow, kind of half at JPL and half at Caltech. So I taught the graphics class at Caltech, and then I started doing things at JPL. And that was just at the time that the Voyager project was going. The Voyager spacecraft, 2 of them were launched to the outer planets just after I got there. It took me a year and a half to get there. So I had a year and a half to develop all the software to do some simulations of the Voyager spacecraft going by the planets. I worked with Charlie Colhase, who was the chief mission designer of the spacecraft. So he was one who figured out the exact trajectory that the spacecraft would go on, so they were timed, so they saw the moons and the planets in their optimal path. And he came down and gave me the data for it, and I did the software, and then I guess the next slide we can show, shows the workstation we had here.
A little different from today's standards.
Yeah, well, maybe not. In the middle was a picture system. This is a black and white line drawing with hardware accelerated 3D rotation and so forth. On the right was the frame buffer with, this is an incredibly crude first approximation of a Voyager spacecraft by Jupiter. And on the left was a text terminal. We didn't have any mice or anything like that. It was all text commands that you typed in. And again, this was on a PDP-11, which had, I think, all of 64K of memory. Maybe we got 128 after a while.
I do want to point out the incredible artwork that's hanging on the wall in this office.
Yeah, well, we got
teapots
everywhere. That was a picture that I made. I was a consultant for the Information International with Gary Demos and John Whitney Jr. So that was a sample teapot that I made at III. Had a very high resolution film recorder. Anyway, a couple years went by before the spacecraft got there, and was able to generate the software where you render a frame, save it to tape, render a frame, save it to tape. And actually, the rendering part was the fun part for me, because I was kind of working around the clock writing software, rendering things. I started rendering. Now I can go to dinner, and it's going to do something useful in my absence, and I could come back and have all these nice frames waiting for me when I got back. It was great. So about 2 weeks around the clock of running the program, and then I had to film it. And God, I hate film. I mean, film is a wonderful medium, but it's just too hard for me to cope with. But this is a film camera that we got. It was a instrumentation camera. which means it didn't have a viewfinder. And so what I had to do is set it up on a tripod, and you unscrewed the gate, removed the metal from that, and screwed in this special telescope-like thing that would let you look through the viewfinder, then adjust the camera so it's looking at the TV screen, and then very carefully unscrew the telescope and screw the gate back in and thread the camera, the film through the camera and do that. And then I had a little program that would read a frame off the tape and click the shutter automatically. And so then we do the 8-hour filming process, which is, you know, you're sitting in a darkened room, put a tape up, say go, and think click, thing, click, thing, click. It took basically a second and a half just to yank the frame off the tape onto the screen. That was the fastest we could pump the pixels through using that speed of computer. And so after 45 minutes, rewind the tape, put the next tape up. It was like 10, 12 tapes worth. And do this, like I say, for something like 8 hours, and hope you don't bump the camera. And then take the film off to be developed. And we got back the film. And now, one thing about this, which was kind of good for me, was that this was never officially requested by the Voyager project. So it's not like they were expecting it, other than, you know, the fact that Charlie knew what we were doing. But so I didn't have a lot of pressure on me, other than my own internal pressure to do something successfully. It's not like I had performance reviews and milestones to meet every 10 minutes, which NASA, you know, for the actual spacecraft, they were, you know, very hyper about, you know, making sure that was reliable. So basically, I got the thing done, and but the Public Information Office didn't really know what to do with the video. They hadn't requested it. It's like, I don't know what we're going to do with this. And fortunately, Charlie had a meeting with the head of NASA just before the first Voyager encounter to just brief him on what's going to happen. So it's going to end. And Charlie, since we made the film together, brought the film with him to show to the head of NASA. And the head of NASA said, hey, this is cool. We need to make copies of this to send out to all the TV networks. And so, which they did. And they said, send us the negative, and we'll make the copies. Oh, the negative? OK. So we sent them the negative, and they lost it. And so we had to film the thing over again. And this time we kept the negative and made the copies ourselves. And so we, you know, that was part of the public information packet we handed out to the news media. So the thing that was shown on the news at night was the film that I made. What I want to show next is actually this Voyager 2 flyby movie, which we need no sound on. Let's see. And this is Voyager 2 encounters Jupiter. This was done 6 months later. The two Voyagers got there 6 months apart. The neat thing was the first Voyager got there and sent back all these neat pictures of Jupiter up close, which I got a hold of and used those as the textures to make the second Voyager movie. So the 4 major Galilean moons, the textures that we see here are fairly accurate representations of what goes on there. I was able to kind of write an inverse texture mapping program and take the photograph and turn it back into the texture, given the geometry of where the spacecraft was. So here's the spacecraft looking at Callisto, the outermost of the Galilean satellites, which is basically, these things are mostly just dirty ice. And all of the motion of the spacecraft was actually timed to what was actually going on in the spacecraft. Every now and then we commanded to do a roll maneuver to sweep the antennas around to show, to measure the magnetic fields in the system and so forth. And then we pan over to Ganymede, I guess, is next. I don't know, a little bit of Jupiter before Ganymede. Again, Charlie Colhay, since he designed the mission, knew what the cool things to look for were. Here we are going through the ring plane. That was something that was discovered by Voyager 1, and so I cobbled together a crude thing to put a line across there at the right time to simulate the ring plane crossing. Here we are at Ganymede, which is, again, a fairly accurate representation of what the surface looked like from that direction. One of the things that people were impressed about these movies is all the star fields are correct. We got a star database from the Smithsonian Astronomical Observatory. And so this is Europa, which is, again, dirty ice with lots of kind of cracks and fissures in it.
I've heard stories that there were people when they see this and they think it's real. They thought Voyager 2 was taking photographs of Voyager 1.
The flecks on the surface there are actually simulations of lightning flashes as opposed to being film, which you might think they were. And here's a zoom in on the moon Io, which one of the things they discovered was active volcanoes on Io in Voyager 1. So I did a little tribute to that on here. And I was really wringing my hands because I want to make sure I got the sign right on the direction that the stuff was coming out of there. Fortunately, I got it right, so the stuff came out instead of going back in, which would have been embarrassing. And here we are on the night side of Jupiter, which we had to kind of enhance the, normally this would be dead black, but we decided to show what's going on a little bit better by making it as though we were comparing this gigantic Klieg light on us to shine on Jupiter. And there's Earth going behind Jupiter, and now the Sun going behind Jupiter. So that's the Voyager 2 flyby moving.
So there were times as well that you know you showed one problem that you had filming.
Yeah.
Right. The negative getting lost.
Yeah.
You've had a couple other.
Well, there was
other
the
interesting accidents
the
happen.
Korean janitor effect, which was basically you set up the camera in a room, and I would go across the hall and run it from across the hall, put a sign on saying "Do not enter filming in progress." And we had a janitor who didn't, you know, was I think from Korea and didn't read English, and so he came along at night while I was filming and opened the door, turned on the lights, started sweeping out the room. So I got this stop motion animation, the reflection of the janitor on the monitor, which then I had to go back and refilm the real thing.
So here we're looking at one of the famous synthetic images of Saturn, and you know, looking at this, and I'll go to the next one, and this is real. So I'll you know, pop back and forth between these two. I mean, there was just a massive, you know, you did a lot of research.
Yeah.
You didn't have these. this didn't happen come to you yet.
Yeah. Well, there are two things about this. One thing you can tell the synthetic one is because the shadow on the rings is not dead black, which it would be in real life. I'll you know, enhance that a little bit to just show what's going on. But the rings are made up of a cloud of little ice particles of different sizes, and so statistically, you can. I was able to research the astronomical literature and figure out the model for clouds of particles and how they transmitted and reflected light depending on the density of particles. And the Voyager 1 did some measurements of that where they actually measured the density of particles by what's called a star occultation. There was a time when a star would go behind the rings during the shadows. There was no light reflecting towards you, and they could measure the brightness of the star as it went behind the rings and then tell how dense the particles were. So I was able to get that database from Voyager 1 when it went by Saturn and do a bunch of playing around. We got basically 20,000 samples from the inner edge to the outer edge, which was very fine detail, which was pretty cool. And I was able to use that to resynthesize the ring particles so that the transparency and the transmissivity of the rings comes out correct when you do that.
So
we have a little bit of, I think, video of that one. Which
Static, real.
Okay, and this is again, no sound on this one. This was not a trajectory of any particular spacecraft. This was something that Charlie and I kind of designed just to show off the ring database more than anything else. And we're flying through the ring particles, and if a spacecraft did that, it'd probably get hit by something and crashed. But and a special purpose program to draw planets and another special thing to draw the streaks when we go through the middle. There's a lot of special purpose thing cobbled together that was designed to make that particular type of image. But you can see the transmissivity of the rings where there are not very many particles per cubic meter, and then the opacity of it when there are more particles per cubic meter.
Yeah, and what year was this? Because
this would have been around
no commercial renderers at this time.
Yeah, this was about 1982. I think we did this, 82 or 83.
Yeah. Any rendering artifacts, any rendering problems, you had to wrote it.
If I get a rendering problem, I call up the guy who wrote the program, which is me, and fix it myself. So also, while I was at JPL, we hooked up with Carl Sagan and the local PBS station who was working on a program called Cosmos. And we did a bunch of animation for Cosmos. Most of it was black and white line drawings because this was kind of earlier on than Saturn, and so I didn't have a lot of shaded images. But at the very tail end of it, they say, hey, we want to make an animation of DNA replication, and we want it to kind of look like this. And I looked at this picture and said, go away, I can't do that. But then I went home last night and I said, well, wait a minute. If I make a Gaussian blob of things here and figure out the densities adding together so that I could run a ray through light, I bet you I can do a picture like that. So I did this other special rendering program, which I called Blobby Molecules, which is the picture on the right there is a frame out of the animation of the DNA replication, which is the big piece of chewing gum there represents an enzyme that's prying the DNA apart prior to being replicated. And this is, again, another nightmare project of 10 to 15 minutes per frame, and I did the whole thing actually on 4s originally because we didn't have time to render the whole thing, and I borrowed time on any PDP-11 at Caltech that had 10 frames from this guy, and 10 frames. We were driving around town, calculating and harvesting frames, and filmed the thing on 4s, which was kind of crude, and they looked at it and said, that's really cool. Can you do it over again on 2s? Because we can afford the time. So this is another rule. There's never enough time or money to do it right the first time, but there's always enough time or money to do it over again. So I did the whole thing on 2s and was very careful to make sure the calculation was correct so that the 2s merged with the other 2s that I already had. So I only had to do another on 4s, but staggered by 2 frames, and it all matched up. Although there's one section when I was filming it, and suddenly there's a bad frame, and I hit the interrupt button before the camera clicked. And this is live while we were filming halfway through the thing, and then I figured out what the thing was, recalculated the bad 20 frames for about an hour, fit them in there, refilmed those, and so the whole thing came out correct, and geez.
First time through. That
yeah,
doesn't
right.
happen often enough.
And so also I used the thing to do more funny running men. Basically, the blobby thing kind of glues things together. So it's like instead of 2 intersecting spheres, you get 2 spheres that kind of melt together is the effect you get. So that's a sample out of that on the left. And the same technique was sort of rediscovered later on in something called metaballs, and another one by the rivals called soft objects. It's sort of like, I guess, 3 independent inventions of the same thing. But this was done, for the Cosmos project in 1980, actually.
So next after that is probably one of the biggest projects of your career, the mechanical universe.
Yeah.
And for those that don't know, this is a program that is still in use. Mm-hmm. So every first year Caltech physics student, that's according to all the stuff I looked up, it's still in use today. And I don't know how many, there are 52 episodes of it?
Yeah, 52 episodes. Actually, before I get to that, we forgot one aspect of this. JPL was a high-tech place in Pasadena, right outside the Hollywood area, and so we became kind of a demonstration place for Hollywood. A lot of Hollywood filmmakers, at one point or another, came through, and I gave demonstrations of them. It was their introduction to computer graphics, and so just the physical juxtaposition is like just down the road, and so a lot of people came through. The notable ones was, somebody said, somebody from Paramount is coming through and wants a demo of what you're doing. Okay, fine, whatever. A guy comes in and says, hi, my name's Gene Roddenberry, and oh, cool. So I gave him a demo of the computer graphics. He was actually working on the first Star Trek movie and looking for found footage that he could use on spacecraft displays and so forth. But I didn't really actually have anything he could use, unfortunately, but got a chance to meet him. Also, George Pal came through. He was retired at the time, film director, and Bob Abel came through and learned about computer graphics and went off and got some equipment himself for his Bob Abel Associates. But my favorite demonstration was to a guy named Ward Kimball. Turns out that my boss at JPL was the next door neighbor to Ward Kimball's daughter, Kelly Kimball. And so he was talking to her over the backyard fence and says, hey, we've got this guy who's doing animation at JPL. Would you like your father like to come and see it? And so Ward Kimball came by. Now, a lot of you people, I understand, come to this conference to meet the people who you have admired and so forth. The thing is, I didn't know the people who I admired. I admired their work, but I didn't know who made it because there was no internet then. You saw it on TV, and that was it. And you didn't know the names of the people who did it. Well, it turns out Ward Kimball was the director of Man in Space and the 2 sub-sequels. But I didn't know that at the time I gave the demonstration. I knew he was an animator for Disney. That was good enough for me. I gave him the demonstration. And afterwards, he went away, and I heard kind of secondhand that he thought the thing was so cool he almost wanted to come out of retirement and go back in animation to play with his new tools that were there. And he invited me to his house to come and see his toys, like his giant steam train and collection of early toys. And so I went over there, and how cool is this? Climbing over Ward Kimball's train set, and then he served lunch, and we were chatting afterwards, and I realized, and he said something about Man in Space, and I realized, oh my God, this is the guy who got me into the business. And so I was able to actually tell him that. And as a similar thing along with that, with the next few things that we're going to show, which is the mechanical universe, The director of that was Frank Capra, you might have seen, who is a fairly famous film director. He was actually a graduate of Caltech in the engineering department. And so when we got going in the mechanical universe, he was made a part of the board of directors, the advisory board, something like that. And so I actually got a chance to meet him at one of the meetings and tell him that, yeah, gee, you got me into this business of doing science animation. So the mechanical universe was the next, big project.
So I know one of my favorite things, we're running a little short, so I'm going to skip it. One of my early memories of my very first SIGGRAPH, so I'm going to make myself look real old right now, is in 1985. And one of the highlights of that, I remembered distinctly, the first part of the show was what we're going to show now, was a snippet of narrated by Jim of the work he did on the mechanical universe. We sit and watch that for a few minutes, then we go through 2 hours of flying logo commercials where the head is pounding, and then the last one would be with some of the very early work from Pixar. And it was really an inspiration for me. I was just starting at Disney and getting going, wow, here are people that are telling stories with this medium. And this is not the first guy you would think of as a storyteller, but a storyteller, educator, and it's amazing, amazing work. So let's.
Well, actually, we had a couple of still frames from that.
Yeah.
We're going to show first. These were all largely diagrams of various physics processes, and I kind of got into the graphic design mode. I kind of did a lot of time doing the graphic design of the placement and the positions of things and the colors and whatnot. So I got into a lot of color coding, and so I used color coding to represent different quantities, sort of like what you call dimensional analysis. Position was green, velocity was yellow, and so forth. And once you get into that, like at the next frame, we have a picture of the surface electric field is this other yellow color, and it started getting kind of complicated, like what color is magnetic flux density and so forth. But so the color theme was kind of uniform through the whole series, and that was part of the kind of contribution I did to that as a do-it-yourself graphic designer. The next frame is this is a frame out of the relativity series, which is basically showing what's called a space-time diagram, which shows this little cartoon of things going on at the speed of light, and then pull it back and extrude it so the vertical dimension is time, and now we can kind of plot things as time versus space and figure out how relativity works. Anyway, so I think the next thing is...
And it illustrates it wonderfully, and going, wow, I get Einstein's theory now after watching it.
Well, there are a lot of things that I was able to do in this series that, I went back to what was it that made it so that I understood it, and then I was able to do an animation of it to show hopefully that other people will understand it.
So now we're going to play that.
There are two things before we play it. Two things I want to say is, one of the things that the SIGGRAPH, I call it the film show because that's what it was in the early days, but it's the electronic theater now actually. And there are a lot of people, more and more people every year have stuff to show, and so they try to show as many as they can, and they kind of encourage you to make the thing as quick as possible. Just show a couple minutes of your stuff rather than the half-hour version. And so there's a little bit of a joke on this thing about how I'm teaching you. The joke refers to the fact that I'm squeezing this basically 4 hours of my work that year into a 3-minute animation. The other thing is that in the mechanical universe itself, I tried to work the teapot in everywhere possible, and so you'll see the teapot showing up in a lot of these little examples. So this one has sound.
The escape from the provincial concerns of earthly life. Travel with me on a journey of understanding to the outer reaches of the solar system. Past giant Jupiter and its moons. Through the rings of Saturn. Past every planet we could dig up in our database. Out to the land of extruded letters. The Mechanical Universe Part 1 is finished. These first 30 programs contain almost 3 hours of computer animation. I now have 3 minutes to teach you all of physics. Calculus is used to describe the motion of objects. The derivative measures the rate of change of a quantity. It is the limit of the slope of a chord as the 2 points get closer together. yielding the slope of the tangent. Symbolically, derivatives will be done by the derivative machine.
Little
It
Chuck
has
Avery
built in
reference
the
there.
basic rules of differentiation.
Chuck Jones reference, huh?
Inside the derivative machine, there is the pattern recognizer, the special case generator, the adder, the identity canceller, and the substitutor. Areas were first found by the ancient Greeks by their method of exhaustion. Kepler also used this technique to find the volumes of certain specific shapes, but neither the Greeks nor Kepler ever found a general method for an arbitrary curved surface. This required the invention of integral calculus.
This is a cross-section of the teapot here.
The first fundamental theorem of calculus says that the derivative of the interval is the original function. So, running the derivative machine backwards takes an interval. Now we can calculate the volumes of any shape. Derivatives and integrals are useful in physics to relate position, shown in green, velocity, shown in yellow, and acceleration, shown in red. This is because taking the derivative of something makes it redder. Now we are ready for the three basic conservation laws. First, conservation of momentum. Momentum is conserved because each body exerts an equal but opposite force on the other. This applies to any number of bodies. Conservation of energy was first hinted at by Galileo. Balls rolling from the same height, potential energy, end up at the same velocity, kinetic energy. The sum of potential and kinetic energy is always the same, except for the energy that is converted to heat, which is the random motion of the molecules in the object. And third, angular momentum. If the twisting force, r cross f, is 0, its integral, the angular momentum, is conserved. The basic laws of mechanics are then used to illustrate such questions as precession of gyroscopes, resonance, wave motion, and ultimately Kepler's law of conic sections and the equal area law. Finally, we show how these results can be used to navigate in space, when the planetary alignments are correct, and the time of day when the launch window opens. Oh, time's about up, but no JPL animation tape is complete without some gratuitous animation of the rings of Saturn. Here we follow the F-ring shepherding satellites as they keep the F-ring particles together in one thin line. Next year, watch for the Mechanical Universe Part 2, Electricity, Magnetism, Special Relativity, and Quantum Mechanics. Well, maybe the year after next.
No, we have time.
Huh?
Yeah.
So one thing that came out of this was that several people came up to me afterwards and said, gee, Jim, we didn't know you had a sense of humor. Because up to that point, it was all space flybys, which is not quite as uproarious as this is.
Well, after that, we have just a few minutes left, and I did want to allow a couple spot for questions, but we can just talk briefly about project mathematics. I know we did have a clip from that, but we'll skip the clip. But just tell us a little bit of project mathematics.
Project mathematics was sort of like a coda, so we say to Mechanical Universe. Mechanical Universe was a college freshman level physics course, total of 52 episodes, which you can still see online at learner.org. Or else there's a link to my website, which I'll point at you at later. But we sort of discovered that a lot of college students didn't have the mathematical background necessary, so we did a bunch of animations of kind of high school level mathematics, which is called project mathematics, that was done at Caltech. And we made five or six of those, which are still available as well.
So another place to learn math and physics. Just look up both of those, and you'll find them both. So, what kinds of things? I mean, you were at Microsoft for 15 years.
Yeah, Microsoft for a while, and what I've been working on basically is algebraic geometry. I've been having the luxury to go back and kind of figure out how geometry and algebra really work, and I've been working on ways of making it easier to understand. A lot of the stuff that we use in computer graphics is something that Jim Kajia actually dubbed mathematical archaeology. We go and read a paper from 150 years ago to describe how a particular equation, what sort of shapes it generates. But a lot of the stuff in mathematics I find hard to read. I can't learn mathematics from mathematicians. I I open a math book and read it, it's like, what the heck are these people talking about? And then I go and kind of play around with it and figure it out, and then I say, oh, that's what they were trying to tell me all along. So what I'm working on is ways of making algebraic geometry more understandable, and this is just a bit of a sample of that, which since I just made it last week, I thought it was pretty. But this is a map of all the possible 2x2 transformation matrices, and you can see singular matrices in yellow and rotations. There's the cone inside and so forth, and which would mean a lot to you if you wanted to sit through an hour-and-a-half lecture on algebraic geometry first. But just give you a little taste of the sorts of things that I'm doing with my time nowadays.
Well, great. Well, I want to open up. I know we're just a couple minutes over, so we got time for one question out of the group, and if there is one.
All questions have been answered.
I don't really have a question. I just wanted to say thank you because I watched that Mechanical Universe. I watched it in my senior level.
Oh, cool. Great, great.
Wonderful.
So it's still being taught.
I'm glad it's still useful. It was originally distributed, and there was a big push to show it. It was funded originally by the Annenberg Foundation. Walter Annenberg was the ambassador to Great Britain under Ronald Reagan, and when he was over there, he saw something called the Open University, which is a bunch of telecourses that they make available on the BBC, and so he funded a foundation to do the similar thing in the United States when he came back, and Caltech got a grant to do physics course and there's other topics. So if you go to a place called learner.org, I believe it's still called, all of the telecourses are there. You can watch them online for free.
So gratuitous plug coming up. I mean, I won't say a big thank you, but any other information? There's stuff that Jim is adding to his website, aptly named jimblinn.com.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot there as yet, so I'm hoping that if I tell people enough about it, that'll be motivated. I got to get this done now.
But thanks very much, and it's been a real treat for me to get to know you over the past couple of weeks. And you know, we met a couple times 20 years ago, and you know, when this came up and Tina asked me to do this, I jumped at the chance to get and meet this wonderful gentleman. So
thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much.